The autumn rain tapped gently against the windows of Kensington Palace as Catherine, Princess of Wales, sat in her private study, her fingers wrapped around a warm cup of tea. The golden leaves outside mirrored the melancholy that had settled over the royal household in recent weeks. News had reached them that morning about Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, an elderly woman from a small village in Yorkshire who had become an unexpected symbol of resilience and hope across the United Kingdom. Eleanor, at 93 years old, had spent the last 6 decades of her life dedicated to helping military families cope with loss and separation. Her own husband had been killed in action during the Falklands War, leaving her to raise their 3 children alone. Instead of retreating into grief, she had channeled her pain into purpose, establishing a small charity from her living room that grew into a nationwide network of support groups for military families. Catherine had first learned about Eleanor's work 3 years earlier during a visit to a veterans center in Newcastle. The staff had spoken of this remarkable woman who somehow managed to visit every family that had lost a service member, traveling across the country despite her advancing age and limited resources. She would arrive at their doors with homemade meals, handwritten letters, and, most importantly, the understanding that only someone who had walked the same difficult path could provide. What made Eleanor's story even more extraordinary was her unwavering optimism in the face of her own challenges. Despite being diagnosed with a rare form of cancer 18 months ago, she had refused to slow down. Her doctors marveled at her determination to continue her work, even as treatments took their toll on her frail body. She had become a living testament to the power of service above self, embodying the very values that the royal family sought to represent. Prince William had been equally moved by Eleanor's dedication when Catherine shared her story with him. As a former search and rescue pilot, he understood the weight that military families carried, the sleepless nights filled with worry, and the profound grief that followed loss. Eleanor's work resonated with both of them on a deeply personal level, representing the kind of quiet heroism that often went unrecognized, but made an immeasurable difference in people's lives. The couple had quietly begun supporting Eleanor's charity, making anonymous donations, and using their influence to connect her with larger organizations that could amplify her impact. They had planned to visit her in person once their schedules allowed, hoping to bring national attention to her work and perhaps encourage others to follow her example of selfless service. But time, as it often does, had other plans. The call that morning had come from Eleanor's daughter, Margaret, who explained through tears that her mother's condition had taken a sudden turn for the worse. The doctors estimated that she had perhaps days, maybe a week at most. Eleanor had expressed one final wish to Margaret, one that seemed almost impossible to fulfill given the circumstances. She wanted to say goodbye to the military families she had been unable to visit in recent months due to her declining health. There were 17 families across England, Scotland, and Wales who had lost loved ones in the past year, families that Eleanor had corresponded with but hadn't been able to meet in person. Her greatest regret, she told Margaret, was leaving these families without the personal connection she had always believed was so crucial to the healing process. Catherine set down her teacup and walked to the window, watching the rain create intricate patterns on the glass. She thought about her own role as a member of the royal family, the platform she had been given, and the responsibility that came with it. Throughout her years as a royal, she had learned that true impact often came not from grand gestures or public ceremonies, but from quiet moments of genuine human connection. She picked up her phone and dialed William's number. He was at a nearby engagement, meeting with youth organizations in London, but she knew this couldn't wait. When he answered, she could hear the background noise of conversation and laughter. "Darling, I need to speak with you about something important," Catherine said, her voice carrying the weight of urgency. "Of course. Give me just a moment." William excused himself from a group and found a quiet corner. "What's happened?" Catherine explained Eleanor's situation and her final wish. As she spoke, she could sense William's immediate understanding of what needed to be done. They had both learned that sometimes the most meaningful actions were those taken without fanfare, without press coverage, without any expectation of recognition. "We need to help her," William said without hesitation. "What do you think we can do?" "I have an idea," Catherine replied, her mind already working through the logistics. "What if we could bring these families to Eleanor? Create a way for her to say goodbye properly?" The plan that began to form in Catherine's mind was both simple and complex. Simple in its intention, to facilitate meaningful connections between Eleanor and the family she had served. Complex in its execution, coordinating the travel and accommodation for 17 families spread across the United Kingdom, all while maintaining the dignity and privacy that such a sensitive situation required. William returned to Kensington Palace within the hour, and together they began making calls. Their private secretary, initially skeptical about the logistics of such an undertaking, quickly became swept up in their determination. The couple's household staff, many of whom had military backgrounds themselves, volunteered their time and expertise to help coordinate the effort. The first challenge was financial. While William and Catherine could certainly afford to cover the cost themselves, they felt that Eleanor's farewell should be a community effort, reflecting the same spirit of collective support that had defined her life's work. They reached out to several organizations that had benefited from Eleanor's efforts over the years, and the response was immediate and overwhelming. A veterans charity offered to cover all travel expenses. A hotel chain volunteered accommodation for the families. Local businesses in Eleanor's village stepped forward to provide meals and transportation. What had started as a royal initiative quickly became a grassroots movement, with people across the country contributing whatever they could to ensure that Eleanor's final wish could be fulfilled. Meanwhile, Catherine personally called each of the 17 families, explaining the situation and extending the invitation. These conversations were among the most emotionally charged of her life. Many of the family members had never spoken directly with a member of the royal family. Yet within minutes of Catherine's gentle explanation, formal barriers seemed to dissolve. She spoke with Sarah Mitchell, whose husband had died in a training accident 6 months earlier, leaving her with twin toddlers and a mountain of grief she didn't know how to climb. Catherine listened as Sarah described how Eleanor's weekly letters had become a lifeline, the one thing she looked forward to in the endless gray days following her husband's death. There was James Thompson, a teenage boy whose older brother had been killed by an improvised explosive device in Afghanistan. James had been angry and lost until Eleanor's visits began, bringing with her not just comfort food and kind words, but stories of other young people who had found ways to honor their siblings' memories through service to others. Catherine also spoke with the Patel family, immigrants who had arrived in Britain 2 decades earlier and whose son had died serving his adopted country. Eleanor had spent hours with them, helping them navigate not just their grief, but also the complex bureaucracy of military benefits and support services. Her assistance had been practical and emotional, bridging cultural gaps with patience and understanding. Each conversation reinforced for Catherine why this effort was so important. Eleanor hadn't just helped these families cope with loss. She had helped them find meaning in their pain, purpose in their grief, and hope for their futures. She had proven that one person, armed with nothing more than empathy and determination, could change dozens of lives for the better. As word of the gathering began to spread through discreet channels, other military families who had been touched by Eleanor's work began reaching out, hoping to be included. The original plan for 17 families quickly expanded to include nearly 50 people, all of whom had been directly impacted by Eleanor's decades of service. The logistics grew more complex, but so did the support network. Military veterans offered to serve as drivers and coordinators. Local churches opened their doors to provide additional meeting spaces. Eleanor's small village, which typically saw perhaps a dozen visitors on a busy day, prepared to welcome one of the most meaningful gatherings in its history. Catherine and William decided that their own presence at the gathering should be understated. This was Eleanor's moment, not theirs. They would attend, certainly, but as facilitators rather than focal points. Their goal was to ensure that Eleanor could have the meaningful connection she desired while maintaining the dignity and privacy that such an intimate gathering required. 3 days before the planned gathering, Catherine received another call from Margaret. Eleanor's condition had stabilized somewhat, giving her enough strength to participate in the farewell she had dreamed of. The doctors were cautiously optimistic that she would have several good hours during which she could engage meaningfully with her visitors. "She keeps asking if this is really happening," Margaret told Catherine through happy tears. "She can't quite believe that all these families are coming to see her. She's been writing personal notes for each family, wanting to have something special to give them when they arrive." Catherine felt her own eyes welling up as she imagined this 93-year-old woman, fighting cancer and exhaustion, spending her remaining energy crafting individual messages of love and encouragement for the people she had served. It was perhaps the most beautiful example of selflessness she had ever encountered. The evening before the gathering, Catherine and William drove to Yorkshire themselves, wanting to ensure that every detail was perfectly arranged. They visited the small community center where the main gathering would take place, checking on the refreshments, the seating arrangements, and the sound system that would allow Eleanor's soft voice to be heard by everyone present. They also stopped by Eleanor's cottage, a modest stone house with a garden full of flowers that somehow managed to bloom even in the late autumn chill. Margaret greeted them at the door, her gratitude evident in her expression. "She's resting now, but she's so excited for tomorrow," Margaret said as she led them into the small sitting room where Eleanor held her weekly planning meetings for the charity. The walls were covered with photographs and letters from military families, creating a visual testament to a life spent in service to others. Eleanor emerged from her bedroom wearing a simple blue dress and a warm smile that immediately filled the room with light. Despite her illness, her eyes sparkled with the same energy and warmth that had comforted hundreds of grieving families over the years. "Your Royal Highnesses," she said, attempting a small curtsy before William gently took her hand. "Please, just William and Catherine tonight," he replied. "We're here as friends, not as royals." Eleanor's smile grew even brighter. "I can't thank you enough for making this possible. I never imagined that my last wish would come true, especially not like this. You've given me the greatest gift imaginable, the chance to properly say goodbye to people who have become like family to me." Catherine sat beside Eleanor on the small sofa, noting the careful way the older woman moved and the slight tremor in her hands. Yet her voice remained strong and clear, filled with the same compassion that had drawn people to her for decades. "Tell us about tomorrow," Catherine said gently. "What would you like this gathering to be like?" Eleanor's face lit up as she described her vision. She wanted to meet with each family individually to share memories and offer final words of encouragement. She had prepared small gifts for each family, photo albums filled with pictures of their loved ones that she had collected over months of correspondence, along with handwritten letters containing specific memories and messages of hope. "I want them to know that their loved ones' sacrifices mattered," Eleanor explained. "I want them to understand that grief is not something to overcome, but something to carry forward with purpose. Most importantly, I want them to know that they are not alone and that the love they shared with those they lost will continue to make a difference in the world." As Catherine listened to Eleanor speak, she realized that tomorrow would be about much more than saying goodbye. It would be a celebration of the power of human connection, a demonstration of how one person's commitment to service could create ripples of hope that spread far beyond anything they might have imagined. The rain had stopped, and through Eleanor's window, the first stars of evening were beginning to appear in the clearing sky. Catherine felt a profound sense of privilege to be part of this moment, to help facilitate what might be one of the most beautiful farewells she would ever witness. Tomorrow would bring tears, certainly, but it would also bring healing, closure, and the kind of human connection that reminded everyone present why service to others represented the highest calling of the human spirit. Eleanor Hartwell, a woman who had never sought recognition or fame, was about to receive the most meaningful tribute possible. The presence of people whose lives she had touched gathered together to thank her and to promise that her legacy of compassion would continue long after she was gone. As Catherine and William prepared to leave Eleanor's cottage that evening, the older woman took Catherine's hand in both of hers. "Thank you for understanding that this wasn't about me," Eleanor said softly. "This was about them, about making sure they know they matter. Tomorrow will be perfect because it's about love, not goodbye." Catherine squeezed Eleanor's hands gently, knowing that tomorrow would indeed be perfect, and that she and William had been privileged to help create something truly extraordinary. A farewell that would touch not just those present, but an entire nation that would soon learn about the remarkable woman who had dedicated her life to ensuring that no military family grieved alone. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Yorkshire countryside as families began arriving at Eleanor's village. From across the United Kingdom, the small train station, which typically saw perhaps a dozen passengers on a busy day, buzzed with quiet activity as people stepped onto the platform carrying flowers, photographs, and handwritten letters of their own. Catherine and William had arrived early, wanting to personally greet each family as they made their way to the community center. They had chosen to dress simply, William in a dark suit without any royal insignia, Catherine in a modest navy dress that spoke of respect rather than formality. Their goal was to blend into the background of this extraordinary day, to be present as supporters rather than central figures. The first to arrive was the Mitchell family. Sarah stepped off the train holding the hands of her twin 4-year-old boys, both dressed in their best clothes and clutching small drawings they had made for the nice lady who writes to Mummy. Sarah's eyes were red-rimmed from a sleepless night of travel and emotion, but her smile was genuine as Catherine approached her on the platform. "Mrs. Mitchell, I'm Catherine. We spoke on the phone." Sarah's formal composure crumbled slightly as she found herself face-to-face with the Princess of Wales in this most unexpected of circumstances. "Your Royal Highness, I can't believe you've done all this. When you called, I thought perhaps I was dreaming." "Please, just Catherine today," she replied, kneeling down to speak with the twins at their eye level. "And you must be Thomas and James. I heard you made something special for Mrs. Eleanor." The boys, initially shy, quickly warmed up as Catherine admired their artwork, crayon drawings of rainbows, and stick figures that they explained were pictures of their daddy watching over them from heaven. Their innocent understanding of the day's significance brought tears to both women's eyes. William appeared with a small van that would transport families from the station to the community center. As more trains arrived throughout the morning, the platform became a gathering place of shared experience. Families who had never met but who shared the common bond of military loss found themselves in quiet conversation, comparing stories of Eleanor's impact on their lives. James Thompson, the teenager who had lost his brother, arrived with his parents and younger sister. His mother, Patricia, carried a thick folder of Eleanor's letters, each one carefully preserved and arranged chronologically. "She wrote to us every week for 8 months." Patricia explained to Catherine as they walked toward the van. "Even when she started getting sick, the letters kept coming. James was so angry after we lost Michael, but Eleanor's words somehow reached him when nothing else could." James himself, now 17 and preparing for university, had written his college admission essay about Eleanor's influence on his life. "She didn't try to fix me or tell me everything would be okay," he told William during their brief ride to the community center. "She just listened and shared stories about other people who had been where I was. She helped me understand that my anger was normal, but that I could choose what to do with it." The Patel family arrived on the mid-morning train, accompanied by their elderly grandmother who spoke little English but insisted on making the journey. Their son Raj had been killed in a vehicle explosion while serving in Afghanistan, and Eleanor had spent countless hours helping them navigate not only their grief, but also the complex cultural intersection of honoring a son who had died serving his adopted country. Eleanor understood something that many people didn't. Raj's father, Vikram, explained to Catherine as they approached the community center. "She knew that our grief was complicated by questions of belonging, of whether our son's sacrifice would be truly honored in a country we had chosen rather than one we were born to. She helped us understand that service and sacrifice create their own form of citizenship, deeper than any document could provide. By noon, nearly 50 people had gathered at the small community center, transforming the usually quiet building into a hub of emotional energy. The space had been carefully arranged to accommodate Eleanor's limited mobility while ensuring that every family would have private time with her. Comfortable chairs were arranged in small circles, with a central area where Eleanor would hold court, moving from group to group throughout the afternoon. Local volunteers from the village had prepared a lunch of simple, comforting foods, sandwiches, homemade soup, and tea served in mismatched china that somehow felt more appropriate than formal catering. The atmosphere was intentionally home-like, reflecting Eleanor's own approach to hospitality and comfort. Eleanor herself arrived just after noon, transported from her cottage in a wheelchair, pushed by Margaret. Despite her physical frailty, she had insisted on doing her hair and applying a touch of lipstick, wanting to look her best for the people who had traveled so far to see her. She wore a simple purple cardigan and carried a canvas bag filled with the individual gifts she had prepared for each family. The moment Eleanor entered the community center, a hush fell over the gathered families. For many of them, this was their first time seeing the woman whose words had sustained them through their darkest hours. She was smaller and more fragile than many had imagined, yet her presence filled the room with an almost tangible sense of love and peace. "My dear friends," Eleanor said, her voice soft but clear in the sudden quiet. "I cannot begin to tell you what it means to have you all here. For years, I have known you through your letters and phone calls, through your stories of love and loss and hope. To see your faces, to be in the same room with you, this is a gift beyond anything I could have imagined." What followed was perhaps one of the most moving afternoons any of those present would ever experience. Eleanor met with each family individually, spending 15 to 20 minutes in intimate conversation. Catherine and William positioned themselves discreetly around the room, available if needed but careful not to intrude on these deeply personal moments. The first family to sit with Eleanor was the Hendersons from Scotland, who had lost their daughter Claire in a helicopter crash during a humanitarian mission. Claire had been their only child, and her death had left them questioning everything they had believed about purpose and meaning. Eleanor's letters had arrived weekly, filled not with platitudes, but with practical suggestions for channeling their grief into action. "You've helped us understand that Claire's death doesn't diminish her life's meaning," Mrs. Henderson told Eleanor through tears. "Your letters taught us that keeping her memory alive meant continuing her work of helping others." Eleanor reached into her bag and withdrew a small photo album labeled Claire's Legacy. Inside were pictures she had collected from Claire's fellow service members, images of the humanitarian projects Claire had worked on, and letters from people whose lives had been touched by her daughter's service. "Claire's story doesn't end with her death," Eleanor told them gently. "Every life she touched, every person she helped, every moment of kindness she showed, these continue to ripple outward. You are her living legacy, and through you, her light continues to shine." Catherine, watching from across the room, found herself deeply moved by Eleanor's ability to find exactly the right words for each family's unique situation. This wasn't generic comfort, but specific, personal understanding born from years of careful attention to each family's individual journey through grief. The Thompson family's time with Eleanor was particularly poignant. James, the teenager who had struggled with anger after his brother's death, sat quietly as his parents spoke with Eleanor about their gratitude for her influence on their son's healing process. When Eleanor turned to address James directly, her words were simple but profound. "Your brother would be proud of the man you're becoming," she told him. "Not because you've stopped being angry. Anger at injustice is appropriate, but because you've learned to channel that anger into purpose. Your college essay about wanting to become a counselor for military families shows that his sacrifice has created something beautiful in you." Eleanor reached into her bag and withdrew a small wooden box. Inside was a medal that had belonged to another young man she had counseled years earlier, someone who had also lost a sibling and had gone on to become an advocate for military families. He asked me to pass this on to someone who would understand its meaning, Eleanor explained. I think that someone is you. The afternoon continued with similar moments of profound connection. Eleanor had somehow managed to prepare something uniquely meaningful for each family. A photo, a letter, a small memento that demonstrated the depth of her attention to their individual stories. But more than the gifts themselves, it was her ability to see and articulate the continuing significance of their loved ones' lives that provided the deepest comfort. William found himself particularly moved by Eleanor's conversation with the youngest attendee, 8-year-old Emma, whose father had died in a training accident. Emma had been too young to fully understand her loss when it happened, and her mother had worried about how to help her process her grief as she grew older. Eleanor knelt down to Emma's level, despite the obvious discomfort it caused her. "Your daddy is still taking care of you," she told the little girl. "Every time you're brave, every time you help someone else, every time you smile when you're sad, that's your daddy working through you. He's not gone. He's just loving you in a different way now." Emma nodded solemnly and handed Eleanor a drawing she had made, a picture of herself holding hands with a figure in a military uniform, both of them surrounded by hearts. Eleanor accepted the drawing with the same reverence she might show a priceless artwork, understanding that for this child, it represented the most precious thing she had to give. As the afternoon progressed, something beautiful began to happen among the families themselves. Brought together by their shared experience of loss and their common connection to Eleanor, they began forming bonds with each other. The Patels found themselves in deep conversation with the Hendersons about the challenge of maintaining cultural traditions while honoring a child's service to their adopted country. Young James Thompson discovered that he wasn't the only teenager struggling with survivor's guilt and anger as he connected with other young people who had lost siblings. Catherine observed these spontaneous connections with growing amazement. Eleanor's gathering wasn't just providing closure. It was creating a new community of support that would continue long after this day ended. Phone numbers were exchanged, promises to stay in touch were made, and plans for future gatherings began to emerge organically. The emotional centerpiece of the afternoon came when Eleanor asked for everyone's attention for a final group address. Margaret helped her to the front of the room, where she stood with obvious effort but unmistakable dignity. "I want to tell you something that I hope you will remember long after today," Eleanor began, her voice carrying clearly across the now silent room. "Your loved ones chose to serve something larger than themselves. In doing so, they gave not just their lives, but they gave meaning to their lives. That meaning doesn't die with them. It lives on in you, in the choices you make, in the love you show, in the service you give to others." She paused, gathering strength, and Catherine noticed that every person in the room was hanging on her words. "I've spent the last 60 years of my life learning one simple truth. Grief shared becomes bearable, but love shared becomes infinite. Your presence here today proves that truth. You have taken your pain and transformed it into connection, your loss, and made it into love. This is the greatest honor you could give to those you have lost." Eleanor's words were met with a silence so profound that Catherine could hear her own heartbeat. Then, slowly, one person began to clap, and then another until the entire room was filled with applause that felt more like prayer than celebration. As the formal gathering began to wind down, Catherine and William made their way quietly around the room, thanking each family for coming and ensuring that everyone had transportation arranged for their journey home. The conversations they had were brief but meaningful, with many families expressing amazement not just at Eleanor's impact, but at the royal couple's role in making this day possible. "You could have just sent flowers or made a donation," Patricia Thompson told Catherine as her family prepared to leave. "But you understood that what Eleanor needed wasn't money or recognition. She needed the chance to say goodbye properly. Thank you for seeing that." William found himself in conversation with several of the military fathers, men who understood his own background as a former RAF search and rescue pilot. They spoke briefly about the unique challenges faced by military families, and William was struck by their unanimous praise for Eleanor's ability to provide support that went beyond what any official program could offer. She understood that we needed more than counseling or financial assistance, one father explained. We needed someone who had walked this path before us, someone who could show us that it was possible to survive this kind of loss and still find meaning in life. As the sun began to set over the Yorkshire countryside, the last of the families prepared to depart. Eleanor, exhausted but radiant, sat in her wheelchair surrounded by the gifts that families had brought for her: drawings, letters, photographs, and small mementos that would remind her of this extraordinary day. Catherine approached Eleanor as Margaret began preparations to take her mother home. "How do you feel?" Catherine asked gently. Eleanor's smile was tired but complete. "I feel finished," she said simply. Not finished in a sad way, but finished like a beautiful song that has reached its final note. "I've said everything I needed to say, and more importantly, I have heard everything I needed to hear. These families don't need me anymore. They have each other now." As Catherine and William watched Eleanor's van disappear down the village lane, they stood in comfortable silence outside the community center. The day had been emotionally exhausting for everyone involved, but it had also been profoundly meaningful in ways that neither of them had fully anticipated. "She's remarkable," William said finally. Catherine nodded, still processing everything she had witnessed. "What strikes me most is how she made today about them, not about herself. Even facing her own death, her focus was entirely on providing comfort and connection for others." They began walking back toward their own car, past the small houses of the village where lights were beginning to come on in windows. The ordinary scenes of evening life, families gathering for dinner, children playing in gardens, the simple routines of daily existence, seemed somehow more precious after a day spent contemplating love, loss, and legacy. "I think we've just witnessed something extraordinary," Catherine said as they reached their car. "Not just Eleanor's farewell, but the birth of something new, a community that will continue her work long after she's gone." William agreed, understanding that today had been about much more than saying goodbye. It had been a demonstration of the power of human connection to transform pain into purpose, grief into grace, and individual loss into collective healing. Tomorrow, they knew, the families would return to their separate lives across the United Kingdom. But they would carry with them not just Eleanor's final words of comfort, but also the knowledge that they were part of something larger, a community bound together by love, sustained by service, and committed to ensuring that no military family would ever grieve alone. The drive back to London would give them time to reflect on the day's events and begin planning how to honor Eleanor's legacy through their own royal platform. But for now, they were content to sit in quiet appreciation of what they had witnessed, a farewell that had somehow become a beginning, a goodbye that had created connections that would last a lifetime. Eleanor Hartwell passed away peacefully 3 days after the gathering, in her own bed, surrounded by the flowers and letters that families had left for her. Margaret called Catherine personally to share the news, her voice steady despite her grief. She spent her last days reading every note, looking through every photograph, and talking about how perfect the farewell had been, Margaret told Catherine over the phone. She kept saying that she had never imagined her life's work could end with such beauty. Catherine felt her own tears flowing as Margaret continued. "She wanted me to tell you and Prince William that you had given her the greatest gift possible. Not just the chance to say goodbye, but the knowledge that her work would continue. She was so proud of the connections the families made with each other." The news of Eleanor's death spread quietly at first, through the network of military families she had served and the organizations that had supported her work. But as more people learned about the extraordinary farewell gathering that had taken place just days before her death, the story began to capture the attention of a much wider audience. The first media coverage came from a local Yorkshire newspaper, whose reporter had noticed the unusual activity in Eleanor's village and investigated further. The story was picked up by regional outlets, then national ones, as journalists struggled to understand how such a remarkable event had remained so private and dignified. What emerged in the reporting was not just the story of Eleanor's life and death, but a deeper examination of the quiet heroism that existed throughout British society. Eleanor became a symbol of service without recognition, of love without expectation, of the kind of everyday compassion that held communities together, but rarely made headlines. Catherine and William found themselves in an unusual position as the story gained momentum. While their role in facilitating Eleanor's farewell was becoming public knowledge, they were determined to keep the focus on Eleanor's legacy rather than their own involvement. They declined interview requests and issued only a brief statement through Kensington Palace expressing their condolences and admiration for Eleanor's life of service. But the families who had attended the gathering began speaking out, sharing their stories of how Eleanor had touched their lives and describing the profound impact of their final meeting with her. These first-hand accounts created a narrative that captured the public imagination in ways that political stories or celebrity news simply could not. Sarah Mitchell, the young widow with twin boys, gave her first media interview to a national television program. Sitting in her modest living room with her children playing quietly nearby, she spoke about how Eleanor's weekly letters had literally saved her life during the darkest period of her grief. "I was drowning," Sarah told the interviewer with quiet honesty. "My husband was gone. I had two babies who needed me, and I couldn't see any way forward." Eleanor's first letter arrived 6 weeks after the funeral, when most people had stopped checking on me. She didn't offer empty platitudes or false comfort. She just shared her own story and reminded me that I wasn't alone. Sarah described how Eleanor's letters had arrived every Tuesday for over a year, each one carefully crafted to address whatever stage of grief Sarah was experiencing. She somehow knew exactly what I needed to hear, exactly when I needed to hear it. When I was angry, she acknowledged my anger. When I was lost, she shared practical advice. When I felt guilty for having moments of happiness, she reminded me that joy was not a betrayal of my husband's memory. The television interview showed excerpts from Eleanor's letters with Sarah's permission. The handwriting was careful and clear, the words chosen with obvious thought and care. One letter, written during Sarah's particularly difficult period around the anniversary of her husband's death, read, "My dear Sarah, I know this week has been impossibly hard. The calendar marks time in ways that feel cruel when you're grieving. But I want you to know that surviving this week is not about being strong or brave. It's about being human. Your husband loved you precisely because you feel so deeply, because you care so completely. Those same qualities that make grief so painful are the ones that made your love so beautiful." The impact of Sarah's interview was immediate and profound. Viewer response was overwhelming, with thousands of people reaching out to share their own stories of loss and the search for meaning in the aftermath of tragedy. More significantly, many viewers expressed a desire to follow Eleanor's example by reaching out to support military families in their own communities. James Thompson, now preparing for his first term at university, wrote an op-ed for a major newspaper titled, "The Woman Who Taught Me That Anger Could Become Action." In it, he described his journey from rage and despair to purpose and hope, all guided by Eleanor's patient correspondence and eventual in-person meetings. "Eleanor never told me to stop being angry about my brother's death," James wrote. "Instead, she taught me to ask different questions about that anger. Not why did this happen, but what can I do with this pain? Not how do I forget, but how do I remember in a way that honors his life?" James's essay included a powerful passage about his decision to study psychology and specialize in grief counseling for military families. "Eleanor showed me that my brother's death, as senseless as it felt, could become the foundation for a life dedicated to helping others navigate similar losses. She taught me that transformation, not recovery, was the goal, that I could become someone who turned his pain into purpose." The essay went viral on social media, shared by thousands of people who recognized in James's story their own struggles with loss and the search for meaning. Comments poured in from readers who had experienced similar transformations, who had found ways to channel their grief into service, creativity, or connection. The Patel family's story added another dimension to the growing narrative around Eleanor's legacy. Vikram Patel spoke to a BBC documentary crew about how Eleanor had helped them navigate the complex intersection of grief, cultural identity, and national belonging. Our son died serving Britain, but we sometimes wondered if Britain truly saw him as one of its own, Vikram explained in the interview. Eleanor understood this doubt in ways that surprised us. She had counseled other immigrant families who had lost children in service, and she knew the particular pain of questioning whether your sacrifice would be truly honored. Eleanor's approach with the Patel family had been characteristically thoughtful and personal. She had arranged for them to meet other immigrant families who had lost children in service, creating a support network that acknowledged their unique experiences while connecting them to the broader military family community. She didn't pretend that racism doesn't exist or that all military families face exactly the same challenges, Vikram continued. But she helped us understand that our son's choice to serve created its own form of citizenship, deeper than what any document could provide. He belonged not because of where he was born, but because of what he chose to give. The documentary crew also interviewed Eleanor's former neighbors and fellow volunteers, painting a picture of a woman who had lived her values quietly and consistently for decades. They spoke of her refusal to accept praise or recognition, her insistence that her work was simply what anyone in her position should do, and her remarkable ability to remember details about hundreds of families across the years. One particularly moving segment featured Mrs. Dorothy Chun, an elderly woman who had worked alongside Eleanor for nearly 20 years. Eleanor never spoke about her own grief, Mrs. Chun explained. She channeled it entirely into caring for others. But I could see it sometimes in quiet moments between visits, a shadow that crossed her face when she thought no one was looking. Her healing came through helping others heal. It was the most beautiful thing I ever witnessed. As the media coverage intensified, Catherine and William made a decision that surprised their staff and the press. Rather than trying to control or limit the narrative around their involvement in Eleanor's farewell, they chose to use the public attention to shine a light on the broader issues Eleanor had dedicated her life to addressing. They announced the creation of the Eleanor Hartwell Foundation, a new charitable initiative that would support existing organizations providing services to military families while also funding innovative approaches to grief support and community building. The foundation would be funded through a combination of royal patronage and public donations, ensuring that Eleanor's work could continue and expand. More importantly, Catherine and William used their platform to highlight other individuals and organizations doing similar work across the United Kingdom. They began a series of quiet visits to military family support groups, veterans organizations, and community initiatives inspired by Eleanor's example. One of their first visits was to a support group in Wales that had been established by another military widow inspired by Eleanor's story. The group met weekly in a church hall, bringing together families who had lost service members with those currently dealing with deployment-related stress and separation. Catherine sat in on one of the group sessions, listening as families shared their experiences and offered support to one another. The conversation was honest and raw, touching on everything from financial struggles to children's behavioral issues to the simple loneliness of missing someone who would never come home. What strikes me about groups like this, Catherine reflected afterward, is how Eleanor's approach has become a template for healing. It's not about professional counselors or formal programs, though those have their place. It's about people who have walked this path, providing guidance to those just beginning the journey. William, meanwhile, began visiting military bases to speak with current service members about the support systems available to their families. His background as a former RAF pilot gave him credibility with active military personnel, and his conversations often focused on the importance of preparing families for the realities of military life, including the possibility of loss. Eleanor's story teaches us that we can't prevent grief, William told a group of young officers at a base in Scotland. But we can ensure that no one grieves alone. Every family that faces loss should have the kind of support that Eleanor provided: personal, consistent, and rooted in genuine understanding. The ripple effects of Eleanor's story continue to spread in unexpected ways. Military families across the country began reaching out to local organizations, offering to volunteer or start new support initiatives. Veterans who had been struggling with their own transitions back to civilian life found purpose in mentoring younger service members or supporting bereaved families. Perhaps most remarkably, the families who had attended Eleanor's farewell gathering began organizing their own support network. Led by Patricia Thompson and Sarah Mitchell, they created an informal group that met monthly, either in person or virtually, to maintain the connections they had formed in Yorkshire. Eleanor brought us together for one afternoon, but she created bonds that will last the rest of our lives, Patricia explained in a follow-up interview. We realized that we had become a family of sorts, connected not just by our losses, but by our commitment to supporting others facing similar challenges. The group began their own outreach efforts, identifying recently bereaved military families in their areas and offering the kind of personal, sustained support that Eleanor had pioneered. They wrote letters, made phone calls, provided meals, and, most importantly, shared their own stories of survival and transformation. Catherine received regular updates on the group's activities through Margaret, who had become an unofficial coordinator for these efforts. Each month brought new stories of connection and healing, families finding purpose in their pain, young people channeling grief into service, communities coming together to support those facing loss. One particularly moving development was the decision by several of Eleanor's adoptive grandchildren, young people she had mentored after they lost siblings, to establish an annual scholarship in her name. The scholarship would support students studying counseling, social work, or other fields related to supporting military families. James Thompson, now thriving in his psychology program, became the first recipient of the Eleanor Hartwell Memorial Scholarship. In his acceptance speech, he spoke about how Eleanor's influence had shaped not just his career choice, but his entire understanding of how to transform pain into purpose. Eleanor taught me that healing is not about forgetting or moving on, James said to the scholarship audience. It's about integrating loss into a life of meaning. She showed me that my brother's death, as devastating as it was, could become the foundation for a life dedicated to helping others find their way through similar darkness. The scholarship fund grew rapidly, supported by donations from across the country. People who had never met Eleanor, but who had been moved by her story, contributed to ensure that her approach to grief counseling and family support would continue through a new generation of trained professionals. 6 months after Eleanor's death, Catherine and William attended the first annual Eleanor Hartwell Memorial Service, held in the small Yorkshire church where Eleanor had worshipped for 7 decades. The service was intended to be a simple memorial, but it became something much more significant. A celebration of how one person's dedication to service had created a movement that was transforming military family support across the United Kingdom. The church was packed beyond capacity, with attendees spilling out into the churchyard and the surrounding streets. Military families, veterans, volunteers, and ordinary citizens who had been inspired by Eleanor's story came together to honor her memory and commit themselves to continuing her work. Catherine spoke briefly during the service, her words carefully chosen to honor Eleanor while challenging the congregation to action. Eleanor Hartwell never sought recognition or fame, she said from the simple wooden pulpit. She sought only to ensure that no military family faced their darkest hours alone. Today, we gather not just to remember her, but to promise that her work will continue through each of us. The service concluded with a reading of names, not just of service members who had died, but of the families Eleanor had supported, the volunteers she had inspired, and the new initiatives that had been created in her honor. The reading took nearly 30 minutes, a testament to the scope of one woman's impact on her community and nation. As Catherine and William left the church that day, they walked past a small garden that had been planted in Eleanor's memory. Families had contributed flowers, herbs, and small trees, creating a living memorial that would grow and change with the seasons. A simple stone marker bore Eleanor's name and dates, along with a quote from one of her letters. Grief shared becomes bearable, but love shared becomes infinite. Standing in that garden, surrounded by the evidence of how Eleanor's love had indeed become infinite through the lives she had touched and the movement she had inspired, Catherine felt a profound sense of gratitude for having been part of something truly extraordinary. Eleanor's farewell had become a beginning. Her goodbye had created connections that would last generations, and her quiet life of service had touched an entire nation. The story was far from over, Catherine realized. In many ways, it was just beginning, as Eleanor's example continued to inspire new forms of service, connection, and healing across the United Kingdom and beyond. The farewell that had touched a nation had become a legacy that would endure long after everyone present that day had passed on, carried forward by the countless lives that had been transformed by one woman's simple commitment to ensuring that love, not loss, would have the final word. 2 years after Eleanor Hartwell's death, Catherine stood in the grand ballroom of Buckingham Palace, preparing to host the first annual Eleanor Hartwell Foundation Gala. The event had grown far beyond anything she and William had initially envisioned, becoming a significant gathering that brought together military families, veterans, government officials, and philanthropists united in their commitment to supporting those who serve. The transformation of Eleanor's small, grassroots charity into a national movement had been remarkable to witness. What began as one woman's determination to ensure no military family grieved alone had evolved into a comprehensive support network spanning the entire United Kingdom. The foundation now operated regional centers, trained professional counselors, coordinated volunteer networks, and provided emergency assistance to families facing military-related crises. Catherine walked through the ballroom, reviewing the displays that told the story of the foundation's growth. Photographs showed support groups meeting in community centers, volunteers delivering meals to newly bereaved families, and young people like James Thompson beginning their careers as military family counselors. Each image represented lives touched by Eleanor's legacy and the ripple effect of compassion that continued to spread. The evening's guest of honor was Margaret Hartwell, Eleanor's daughter, who had become an unexpected public figure as the Foundation's honorary president. Margaret had initially resisted any public role, preferring to grieve privately and return to her quiet life as a retired teacher. But as Eleanor's story gained national attention and the Foundation grew, Margaret realized that she had a unique responsibility to ensure her mother's values remained at the heart of the expanding organization. "My mother would be absolutely amazed by all of this," Margaret told Catherine as they reviewed the evening's program. "She always said her work was nothing special, just what any decent person would do." To see it recognized at this level, in the palace itself, would have both delighted and embarrassed her. Catherine smiled, remembering Eleanor's humble demeanor during their brief meeting. "I think she would be most pleased by the fact that it's not really about her anymore. It's become something larger, a movement that reflects her values but has taken on its own life." The gala's program included presentations from several of the families who had attended Eleanor's farewell gathering. Sarah Mitchell, now remarried but still actively involved in military family support, would speak about how Eleanor's influence had shaped her new life. James Thompson, about to graduate from university with a degree in psychology, would discuss his plans to open a specialized counseling center for military families dealing with traumatic loss. The Patel family had become particularly active in the Foundation's multicultural outreach program, working to ensure that immigrant military families receive culturally sensitive support. Vikram Patel had become one of the Foundation's most effective advocates, speaking at conferences and training sessions about the unique challenges faced by families navigating both grief and questions of belonging. As guests began arriving for the gala, Catherine found herself reflecting on how profoundly the experience of Eleanor's farewell had affected both her and William's approach to their royal duties. The intimate gathering in Yorkshire had demonstrated the power of personal connection over public ceremony, the importance of listening over speaking, and the value of facilitating rather than leading. These lessons had influenced their subsequent charitable work in measurable ways. They now prioritized smaller, more intimate engagements that allowed for genuine conversation over large public events designed primarily for media coverage. They had restructured their staff to include more people with direct experience in the causes they supported, ensuring that their initiatives remained grounded in real need rather than good intentions. William arrived at the ballroom fresh from a visit to one of the Foundation's regional centers in Liverpool, where he had met with a group of teenagers who had lost military parents. His experience with these young people had reinforced his understanding of how Eleanor's approach, treating grief as something to integrate rather than overcome, was transforming traditional approaches to military family support. The counselors at the Liverpool Center are using Eleanor's methods with remarkable results, William told Catherine as he adjusted his formal wear. Instead of trying to help these kids get over their losses, they're helping them understand how their experiences can become sources of strength and empathy for others. The evening began with a reception where guests mingled informally, many sharing their own stories of how Eleanor's example or the Foundation's work had touched their lives. Catherine and William moved through the crowd, listening more than speaking, struck by the continuing evidence of how one person's commitment to service could create such far-reaching transformation. They spoke with Colonel David Morrison, who had recently returned from Afghanistan and was working with the Foundation to improve support for families facing deployment stress. Eleanor's model works because it's based on genuine relationship rather than professional distance, Morrison explained. The families trust volunteers who have been where they are, who understand the specific challenges of military life. Nearby, they encountered Dr. Helen Richards, a grief counselor who had completely restructured her practice after learning about Eleanor's approach. Traditional counseling often focuses on helping people return to their previous state of normal, Dr. Richards told them. Eleanor understood that after profound loss, there is no going back, only forward into a new version of yourself. Her method helps people embrace that transformation rather than resist it. The formal program began with Margaret taking the podium to welcome the guests. Her speech was brief but powerful, focusing not on her mother's accomplishments, but on the continuing work that remained to be done. My mother believed that every act of kindness creates ripples that extend far beyond what we can see, Margaret said to the assembled crowd. Tonight, we are witnessing those ripples. Every family supported, every volunteer trained, every young person inspired to service. These are the ripples of her compassion continuing to spread. Margaret introduced a video presentation featuring interviews with families from across the United Kingdom who had been touched by the Foundation's work. The stories were varied, but shared common themes: the importance of peer support, the value of understanding volunteers, and the transformation that could occur when grief was channeled in a service to others. One particularly moving segment featured the Johnson family from Northern Ireland, who had lost their son in a vehicle explosion. The family had been struggling not only with their grief, but with their community's complex relationship with military service. Through the Foundation, they had connected with other families facing similar challenges and had become advocates for understanding military service as separate from political conflict. Eleanor's approach helped us understand that honoring our son's choice to serve didn't require us to support every military action, Mrs. Johnson explained in the video. It simply required us to support the families who share the burden of military service. That distinction made all the difference in our healing. The video also featured updates on many of the young people Eleanor had counseled. Several had followed James Thompson's path into careers focused on supporting military families. Others had channeled their experiences into art, writing, advocacy, or community service. What united them all was their understanding that their losses, while devastating, had also equipped them with unique capacities for empathy and service. When Sarah Mitchell took the podium to speak about her experience, the ballroom fell completely silent. She had become one of the Foundation's most effective spokespeople, But her words carried particular weight because of her obvious authenticity and the depth of her ongoing connection to the community Eleanor had created. 2 years ago, I brought my twin boys to Yorkshire to meet a woman I had never seen but who had saved my life through letters, Sarah began. I thought we were going to say goodbye to someone who had helped us. Instead, we discovered that we were part of a family we didn't even know existed. Sarah described how the relationships formed during Eleanor's farewell gathering had sustained her family through subsequent challenges, including her decision to remarry and her husband's deployment to Eastern Europe. The support network Eleanor created didn't end with her death. It became stronger because we all understood that continuing her work was the best way to honor her memory. She concluded her remarks with an announcement that surprised even the Foundation's organizers. Tonight, I'm announcing the creation of the Eleanor Hartwell Letter Project. Inspired by the weekly letters that save my sanity, this initiative will train volunteers to maintain regular written correspondence with military families facing crisis. Because sometimes the most powerful support comes not from professional programs, but from personal connection. The announcement generated immediate enthusiasm from the audience, with several people approaching the registration tables that had been quickly set up around the ballroom. Catherine watched with amazement as the initiative that had begun with Eleanor's simple decision to write letters to grieving families continued to evolve and expand in ways that honored her original vision while adapting to contemporary needs. James Thompson's presentation focused on the research and training programs that were emerging from universities across the country. His own psychology program had developed a specialized track in military family counseling based on Eleanor's methods. Similar programs were being established at other institutions, creating a new generation of professionals equipped with both academic training and experiential understanding. Eleanor proved that the most effective counselors are often those who have personal experience with the challenges they're addressing, James told the audience. These new training programs combine professional education with peer mentorship, ensuring that future counselors understand both the theory and the lived reality of military family life. The evening's most emotional moment came when a group of current military family members took the stage together. They represented families from different services, different regions, and different stages of military life. Some dealing with deployment separation, others coping with return and readjustment, still others facing the reality of permanent disability or death. What united them was their participation in the support networks that had grown from Eleanor's original model. They spoke about how peer counseling, regular communication, and community connection had helped them navigate challenges that might otherwise have overwhelmed them. The difference between surviving a military family crisis and thriving after it often comes down to whether you feel alone, explained Staff Sergeant Maria Santos, whose husband had been severely injured in a training accident. Eleanor's model ensures that no one has to face these challenges alone, and that support comes from people who truly understand what you're experiencing. The program concluded with Catherine and William presenting the first Eleanor Hartwell Awards to individuals and organizations that exemplified Eleanor's values of quiet service and compassionate support. The recipients included volunteer coordinators, military family advocates, and young people who had transformed their own experiences of loss into service to others. But the most significant award went to the collective group of families who had attended Eleanor's farewell gathering and subsequently created their own support network. Margaret presented the award to representatives of the group, acknowledging how they had taken Eleanor's final gift, the connections formed during that emotional afternoon in Yorkshire, and built them into something lasting and meaningful. "My mother brought you together for one afternoon," Margaret said as she presented the award. "You chose to stay together for a lifetime." That transformation of a single moment of connection into an enduring community of support represents everything she hoped her work would accomplish. As the formal program ended and guests moved to a reception, Catherine found herself in conversation with a young military wife who had recently moved to England from Canada. The woman, Lisa Chun, had heard about the foundation through social media and had reached out for support as she navigated the challenges of military life in a new country. What amazes me about Eleanor's story, Lisa told Catherine, is how she proved that you don't need special training or professional credentials to make a profound difference in people's lives. You just need to care enough to pay attention and show up consistently. Catherine nodded, thinking about how Eleanor's example had influenced her own approach to royal duties. I think Eleanor understood something that many people in positions of influence miss. That real impact comes from genuine relationship, not from titles or platforms. She had no official authority, but she changed hundreds of lives because she was willing to truly see people and meet them where they were. As the evening concluded, Catherine and William stood together in the now quiet ballroom, surrounded by the evidence of how Eleanor's simple commitment to service had grown into a national movement. The displays around the room told the story of ongoing transformation. Families healed, communities strengthened, young people inspired to service, and a society that better understood the true cost of military service. Do you think Eleanor could have imagined this when she started writing those first letters? William asked, gesturing at the remnants of the gala. Catherine considered the question, remembering the humble woman they had met in that small Yorkshire cottage. I think she would be amazed by the scale, but not by the principle. She always understood that compassion shared becomes infinite. Tonight proved that truth in ways even she might not have expected. 6 months later, Catherine stood in a very different setting. A small military housing complex in Wales where the Foundation had opened one of its newest family support centers. The building was modest, a converted community center that had been transformed into a welcoming space where military families could gather for everything from playgroups to grief counseling to practical workshops on managing deployment stress. The center was bustling with activity on the day of Catherine's visit. In one room, a group of military spouses met for their weekly coffee and conversation group. In another, teenagers participated in a leadership program designed to help them channel their experiences of military family life into positive community engagement. A third space hosted a training session for new volunteer letter writers, people inspired by Eleanor's example to offer written support to families in crisis. Catherine moved through the center quietly, observing the natural way that people connected and supported each other. The atmosphere was warm and informal, reminiscent of Eleanor's own approach to hospitality and care. Professional staff members were present, but took secondary roles to the peer supporters and volunteers who formed the heart of the center's work. In the main meeting room, Catherine attended a gathering of local military families who came together monthly to share resources, celebrate successes, and support each other through challenges. The conversation was honest and practical, covering everything from managing finances during deployment to helping children cope with frequent moves to maintaining marriages under the stress of military life. What struck Catherine most was how naturally families who had been through various challenges took on mentoring roles with those facing similar situations for the first time. A couple who had successfully navigated a difficult reintegration after combat deployment offered guidance to a family just beginning that process. A widow who had rebuilt her life after loss provided perspective to someone in the early stages of grief. This is exactly what Eleanor envisioned, Margaret told Catherine as they watched these organic connections forming. She always said that the best support comes from people who have been where you are and can show you that survival is possible. The Wales Center was one of 12 that had opened across the United Kingdom in the 2 years since Eleanor's death. Each center adapted Eleanor's basic principles to local needs and circumstances, but all shared the same commitment to peer support, personal connection, and practical assistance. The results had been remarkable: reduced family stress, improved community integration, and decreased instances of crisis among participating families. During her visit, Catherine had the opportunity to meet with some of the young people who had been inspired by Eleanor's story to pursue careers in military family support. They represented a new generation of professionals who combined academic training with personal understanding, creating a more effective and empathetic approach to family services. Among them was David Kim, whose father had been killed in Afghanistan when David was 15. Like James Thompson, David had channeled his grief into purpose, earning a degree in social work and specializing in military family counseling. He now worked at the Wales Center, providing both individual counseling and group facilitation. Eleanor's approach changed everything about how I understood my own loss, David told Catherine during their conversation. Instead of seeing my father's death as something that broke our family, I learned to see it as something that equipped me to help other families facing similar challenges. That shift in perspective made all the difference. The center also hosted a monthly letter-writing workshop where volunteers gathered to maintain correspondence with military families across the region. The initiative, inspired by Eleanor's original approach, had grown to include hundreds of volunteers who provided regular, personal communication to families dealing with deployment, injury, loss, or other military-related challenges. Catherine observed one of these sessions, watching as volunteers carefully crafted individual letters to families they had been matched with through the center's coordination system. The letters were personal and specific, addressing the unique circumstances each family faced while offering the kind of ongoing support that Eleanor had pioneered. The key is consistency and authenticity, explained Mrs. Ruth Williams, the volunteer coordinator who had been trained by Eleanor herself years earlier. These aren't form letters or generic encouragement. Each volunteer develops a real relationship with their assigned family, learning about their specific needs and circumstances and responding accordingly. The success of the letter-writing program had surprised even the Foundation's organizers. In an age of digital communication, the power of handwritten letters to provide comfort and connection had proven remarkably enduring. Families consistently reported that receiving weekly letters created a sense of being genuinely cared for in ways that more impersonal forms of support could not match. As Catherine's visit to Wales concluded, she reflected on how Eleanor's simple insight, that grief shared becomes bearable while love shared becomes infinite, had proven true in ways that continued to exceed all expectations. The movement that had grown from one woman's commitment to writing letters had become a comprehensive network of support that was transforming military family life across the United Kingdom. The final validation of Eleanor's approach came in an unexpected form: official recognition from the Ministry of Defense. The military leadership, initially skeptical of civilian-led family support initiatives, had become convinced by the measurable improvements in family resilience and retention among units connected to Eleanor Hartwell Foundation programs. The announcement of official partnership came during a ceremony at the Imperial War Museum, where Catherine and William joined senior military officials in recognizing the Foundation as a preferred provider of family support services. The partnership would provide funding and infrastructure while maintaining the peer support model that made Eleanor's approach so effective. This partnership represents a fundamental shift in how we understand military family support, explained General Patricia Morrison during the ceremony. We've learned that the most effective assistance often comes not from institutional programs, but from personal relationships built on shared experience and genuine understanding. The ceremony included presentations from military families who had benefited from Foundation services, demonstrating the concrete impact of Eleanor's approach on real lives. The stories ranged from crisis intervention that had prevented family breakdown to long-term mentoring that had helped military children thrive despite the challenges of military life. Perhaps most significantly, the partnership included provisions for training military personnel themselves in Eleanor's peer support methods. This would create a hybrid model combining professional military family services with the authentic, relationship-based approach that Eleanor had developed through decades of experience. As Catherine and William left the ceremony, they carried with them a profound sense of completion. Eleanor's quiet work had not only touched individual lives, but had fundamentally changed how an entire society understood and supported military families. The farewell gathering in Yorkshire had indeed touched a nation, creating ripples of compassion that continued to spread in ways Eleanor herself could never have imagined. The story that had begun with one woman's determination to ensure no military family grieved alone had become a testament to the power of service, the importance of genuine connection, and the possibility that individual acts of love could indeed become infinite when shared with others. Eleanor Hartwell's legacy lived on not in monuments or recognition, but in the countless lives that continued to be transformed by the simple truth she had discovered, that caring for others in their darkest moments was not just an act of service, but a source of healing that benefited both the giver and receiver. Years later, when people spoke of the Eleanor Hartwell Foundation and its impact on military families across the United Kingdom, they would remember not the programs or policies, but the principle that had started it all, that love shared becomes infinite, and that every act of genuine compassion creates ripples that extend far beyond what we can imagine. In that truth, Eleanor's farewell had indeed become eternal, touching not just a nation, but future generations who would continue to benefit from her simple commitment to ensuring that no family faced their darkest hours alone.